Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ann Betts, and I welcome you to today's session, What's Your Type? The Past, Present, and Future of Personality Testing with Merve Emre. In today's session, Merve will explore the utopian and dystopian aspects of personality testing. Focusing on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, she will examine how the language of type has infiltrated our workplaces, our relationships, and our innermost lives, and how this all impacts the world of coaching. This discussion will have us thinking about the inherent biases and prejudices hidden in the language of type and the difference between individual and collective systems of social organization. Merve Emre is Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford. She's the author of Paraliterary, The Making of Bad Readers in Postwar America, The Ferrante Letters, and The Personality Brokers. She's also the executive producer of Persona, available on HBO, which is somewhat of an extension of The Personality Brokers into today's world. Her essays and criticism regularly appear in publications like The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, Harper's, New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and the London Review of Books. And in 2022, she will serve as one of the judges of the International Booker Prize. We are very, very lucky to have Merve with us for this presentation and the Q&A afterwards. More details on her achievements can be found on the Converge website. Please join me in welcoming Merve Emre.
Hi, Converge. I'm Merve Emre, a professor of English at the University of Oxford and author of the book, The Personality Brokers, The Strange History of Myers-Briggs and the Birth of Personality Testing. And I'm very excited to be with you today to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and the future of personality testing and what its relationship to coaching might be. So to begin, what precisely is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is the subject of my book and my entry point into the larger world of personality testing? I assume that many of you have heard of the MBTI, if not actually taken an MBTI indicator, or even if you don't know your MBTI type. So I will try to run through this as briefly as possible so that I can get to the good stuff. So many of you probably know that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is the most popular personality indicator in the world, that it is administered to over 2 million people per year, and that it is used by 86 of the Fortune 100 companies. It has a presence in almost every major institution of life that you can think of, whether it's your workplace, a school, the church, the military, or even a therapist's office. So what precisely is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator? The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator gives you a snapshot of your personality in a series of 4 letters. And you can see all of the different 4-letter combinations in the middle of the slide over here. How does it give you that snapshot of your personality? Well, it asks you to assess your preferences on a questionnaire along 4 different dichotomies. The first one focuses on where you get your energy from, whether you are extroverted or introverted. And according to the personality indicator, if you are extroverted, you are somebody who tends to get their energy from other people. You like to be in a fast-paced environment and you enjoy being the center of attention. And the symbol for extroversion, as you can see on the top corner of your screen, is E. If you're introverted, you are someone who prefers to get your energy from yourself, from being alone with your thoughts, from observing other people rather than being the center of attention. And in that case, the indicator gives you the letter I. The second dimension along which the indicator assesses your preference is how you prefer to take information in, whether you are a sensing type or whether you are an intuitive type. If you are a sensing type, then you are someone who tends to pay attention to concrete facts and details, to prefer ideas that have practical applications, and to use them to describe the world in a highly specific and tactile way. If, on the other hand, you are an intuitive type, then you are someone who notices the big picture and the possibilities of how things can be. So if the first dichotomy was E or I, the second that we have is S or N. The third dichotomy is how you prefer to make decisions, whether you make decisions in an impersonal and logical way and are thus a thinking type, or whether you make decisions according to your feelings and according to how you perceive the feelings of other people to be impacted. And that is a feeling type, so T or F. And finally, the fourth dichotomy is interested in how you prefer to organize your life. Whether you are someone who believes that rules and deadlines should be respected, you are someone who likes to plan things ahead of time, then you are a judging type. And if you are someone who prioritizes spontaneity and you prefer to leave things open, then you are a perceiving type. And you can see how these four different dimensions with these two different dichotomies give us the 16 personality types that are represented in the middle of the screen. And if you are someone who has taken a Myers-Briggs type indicator, I'm sure that you can locate your type in the middle. Now, the Myers-Briggs type indicator was interesting to me when I started researching it because it seemed like something that was almost set in stone, as if it had been around forever. And perhaps like many of you, I assumed that the two last names that were conjoined by the hyphen Myers and Briggs belonged to two men, and that these two men had some kind of psychological or sociological training, and they had met perhaps in a scientific laboratory where they designed the indicator. And from their connections and their know-how, it ascended to the current status that it occupies as the most popular personality indicator in the world. And so I was surprised when I began my research to learn that Myers and Briggs were in fact two women, a mother, Katharine Cook Briggs, and her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers. And so the question that began to concern me was, how was it that these two women, who, as it turned out, had absolutely no formal training in psychology or sociology, ended up designing the Myers-Briggs type indicator? What was their journey from homemakers, wives, and mothers to inventors? And how could that journey tell us something, not only about the history of type, but why it is that type appeals to us today? Because I think one thing that no one would deny is that there is a kind of intuitive appeal to type, that we like telling other people our type. We like using words like extroverted and introverted. And when other people use them, we like to understand, or we like to think that we know what they mean. So how was it that these two women designed a system that was, if not exactly scientific, and I will get to that in a moment, then certainly linguistically appealing? So to give you a little bit of a history about the family, I should tell you that Katharine Cook Briggs, whom you see on the left-hand side of your screen, was born in Michigan and attended Michigan Agricultural College at the age of 15. She was a brilliant, brilliant woman who graduated at the top of her class and, of course, married the man who graduated second to her. And his name was Lyman Briggs. And when they were married, they moved together to Washington, D.C., where Lyman would begin his postdoctoral studies, and Katharine, it was assumed, would do very little other than raise the couple's children. But after having 3 children, 2 of whom died very early into childbirth, very early after they were born, she decided that what she needed to do was find a way for each child that did survive, in her case, her only daughter, Isabel, to become the most self-actualized version of herself. And she thought that if you could help each child in this world figure out what it was that they were innately suited to do, then you would not only ensure that child's happiness And you would not only protect that child's soul and allow it to flourish, but you could also organize all of human society so that it too flourished. And so when Isabel was little, Catherine opened what she called the Cosmic Laboratory of Baby Training. And she began to design personality questionnaires that would allow her to assess not only her daughter, but also the children of the neighbors who would bring their children to Catherine's Cosmic Laboratory. And she would ask them all sorts of questions on her questionnaire, like, is your child more open with strangers or closed off with strangers? Is your child relatively easygoing or irritable? And for those of you who have taken an MBTI questionnaire, you might recognize in Catherine's early child rearing questionnaires the exact same forced choice system that we see in the MBTI today. So she was really its progenitor, the progenitor of the questionnaire and its form. But she was also the one responsible for bringing the vocabulary of type that I laid out for you at the beginning of my talk to the questionnaire. In 1923, she read the English translation of the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung's book, Psychological Types. And she became absolutely obsessed with Jung's way of thinking about the world. And one thing that I just want to flag for you is that although she derived her vocabulary of type from Carl Jung, what the terms extroverted and introverted, thinking and feeling, intuition and sensing meant for Jung were very different from what they ended up meaning for her. And in fact, what they mean for many of us today who encounter those terms first and foremost in a workplace environment. So for Jung, a term like extroversion and introversion, those terms were about one's subjectivity. And what I mean by that is that extroversion and introversion were relative measures of how secure you were in your sense of self, how much you trusted yourself and your perception of the world above what other people around you were doing. And in Jung's Psychological Types, the very famous example that he gives is that an extrovert and an introvert will react very differently to the fact that the weather is bad. So on a blustery or a rainy day, the extrovert who wants to adapt himself chameleon-like to his external circumstances will say, give me my hat and my coat so that I may go outside. Whereas the introvert will say, let the elements do what they will. I am stronger than the weather. And you can see how that means something very different from the way that the type indicator has come to define those terms as being about where you gain your energy from. Similarly, sensing and intuition meant something very different for Carl Jung, for whom sensing meant the ability to internalize information through your sense organs, your sense of sight, your sense of smell, your sense of taste and touch, whereas intuition meant the capacity to, quote, see around the corners and through the walls of the human heart, as he wrote in a letter to Catherine Briggs, who began to correspond with him about his system of type. And I tell you this both because it's historically interesting, but also because I think it's very important to stress that the categories that we take to be innate aspects of personality, in fact, have histories unto themselves. And understanding what the type indicator is, or even what personality as a concept is, requires that we think historically about those terms. So, to get back to our story, Catherine read Carl Jung's Psychological Types, and from his system of type, she began to devise her own theories of personality. And for her, the cornerstone of her theory of personality was that type never changed. You were born a particular type, you would live as a particular type, and you would die as a particular type. It was to her a completely essential facet of one's personhood. Now, her daughter Isabel, whom Catherine reared in her Cosmic Laboratory of Baby Training, grew up to be an exceptionally talented young woman. She went to Swarthmore, she got married, she had 2 children, and as I will mention in a moment, she became a very, very popular writer of detective novels. And like I said, I will speak about those novels in a moment. But she was someone who, like her mother, had a great facility for language. And although she wasn't particularly interested in her mother's vocabulary of type when she was growing up, after her children went to school and she was alone in her home and experiencing a similar kind of crisis as the one her mother experienced when she had been left at home alone with only one child to raise after the other two had died, she began to wonder how it was that she could contribute something to the world. And she remembered her mother's system of type. And she remembered it at a very particular moment in human history. So if Catherine was born in the mid-19th century and did all of her schooling toward the turn of the century, then Isabel is very much a child of World War II. Or rather, I should say that, Isabel was born at the beginning of the 20th century, but she came into her own with the system of type just before and during World War II, which was when her children left the home and she was alone. And she looked around at the war effort. And she also looked around immediately after the war at the fact that all of a sudden there were many, many, many more workers in the American workplace. And there weren't necessarily blue collar workers who were working in factories or in industry, but there were workers who were increasingly doing service jobs, the kinds of jobs where it was absolutely essential that you not only worked with other people, but that you worked for other people. And whereas blue collar jobs or factory jobs had relatively easy ways of gauging productivity, how good you were at screwing a widget onto the side of a car, for instance, it was much harder to figure out what it was that made somebody good at a white collar job, a job that was primarily about interacting and communicating with other people. And so in the early 40s, as Isabel was looking around at the workplace and she was trying to figure out how you could fit the worker to the job that was best suited for them, she came across a personnel consultant named Edward Hay, who was the father of one of her son's classmates. And she volunteered her work, her time to him. And he asked her to start validating different personality tests that had recently come on the market to do precisely what she was interested in doing, matching the worker to the job that was best suited for them. And the more she worked with different personality tests, the more she discovered that what was fundamentally lacking in them was a sense of non-judgmental sorting. So many of the personality tests of the late 30s and the early 40s were interested in separating people who had quote unquote good personalities from people who had quote unquote bad personalities, i.e. people who were lazy, people who were intellectually deficient, people who were sympathetic to labor, because you have to remember that this is the 30s and the 40s, and people who otherwise would be non-productive. But Isabel was convinced that if you could design a personality test that told people that they were all valuable and that all it was doing was matching them with the job that was best suited for them, they would be more willing to bind themselves to their work freely and gladly. That is, they would be more willing to work longer for less compensation. And you can probably sense from the way that I'm teeing this up that if on the one hand, this could be immensely beneficial to people because it could give them a language for understanding themselves and their role in a workplace or any kind of larger social organization, it could also be a source of great exploitation. So the more Isabel worked for Edward Hay, the more she was convinced that she could design a better type of personality test. And in 1942, she submitted the prototype, the patent, for the Myers-Briggs type indicator, although then it was actually called the Briggs-Myers type indicator because she put her mother's name first. And while the Myers-Briggs type indicator looked very different in 1942 from the way that it looks today, the basic concept was still the same, that one would take a forced choice multiple choice questionnaire, and that questionnaire would assess your preferences along these 4 different dimensions and sort you as one of 16 personality types. So I promised that I would speak a little bit about Isabel's past as a mystery novelist. And I raise it not only because I find it biographically interesting, but because I think that she was already sorting out her system of type in fiction before she sorted it out in these essentially bureaucratic documents. And if you can get your hands on any of her novels, although they're a bit difficult to come by, you might get a kick out of reading them. Because what they do is they feature teams of detectives that work together to solve a mystery. And the mystery can only be solved by each detective using his distinctive skill set, his distinctive preferences in order to contribute something to the communal cause of finding the killer and bringing him to justice. And so you have a little prototype of type being worked out within the pages of these novels, even before it is worked out in the questionnaire. So that offers you a sort of brief history of how these two women came to design the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And of course, there's much, much, much more to say about that. And the full history is something that I cover in my book, The Personality Brokers. But I want to spend a little bit of time just exploring how it is that Myers-Briggs became as popular as it is today. What does that trajectory look like? Because it's very much a story about institutions. So if the first half of the history of Myers-Briggs was about two individuals, and perhaps three if you count Carl Jung, then the question of its popularity is really much more a story of the massive institutions of post-war America taking up the type indicator and using it as part of their daily operations. And I will simply trace that history through a handful of institutions. The first is the military. So the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA, was among the first of Isabel Briggs Myers' clients. And they used it, and you can see in this picture that these are potential recruits for the OSS filling out personality questionnaires. They used it to try to match covert operatives to the missions that were best suited to their personality. From there, various members of the OSS migrated into U.S. institutions of higher education, particularly institutions like Berkeley and Stanford, which were very interested in figuring out how you could design personality tests that would match students to the roommates that were best suited for them, to the majors that were best suited to them, or the professional schools that were best suited to them. And so the picture that I'm showing you here is of a researcher named Ravenna Helson, who worked at the Institute for Personality Assessment and Research at the University of California, Berkeley, and who worked intimately with the Myers-Briggs type indicator to try to figure out how you could organize higher education in the most efficient way possible. She also did a wonderful study with novelists and other creative types to figure out what made for a creative personality. And I don't have time to go into that now, but it is one of my favorite chapters in the book. From there, the Myers-Briggs type indicator migrated to ETS, the Educational Testing Service, which some of you might know as the publisher of the SAT. And in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a push to see if there was any way to design a personality test that would do for personality what the SAT had done for aptitude, which was a test that could be used to assess every single high school student to figure out whether or not they had the right kind of personality to go to college, and once they were there, what they would do. Now, unfortunately, MBTI hit a snag at ETS, which was that the researchers at ETS, the world's top psychometricians and statisticians, could not validate it. And this is a problem that has plagued MBTI since its origin days, that it is very difficult to find it either valid or reliable. That is, it does not seem to measure what it says it measures. And when the test is taken repeatedly, when the questionnaire is filled out repeatedly, it does not give you the same answer over 50% of the time. So at ETS, it hits a bit of a snag, and the test would have died then and there if it weren't for a small psychological publishing company called CPP from the West Coast that swooped in and became its publisher. And when CPP became its publisher, They changed the questionnaire around so that it was significantly shorter. They broadened the descriptions of the types so that they fit more people, and they started marketing it to some of the most prominent and lucrative businesses, especially on the East Coast through the 80s and the 90s. And that is, in brief, the story of how MBTI became a household meme. And here you can see that one of the most popular adoptions of it today is to match people to their Game of Thrones character, their Disney princess, or their Harry Potter character. And of course, websites, which you might know of, like BuzzFeed, have made a killing off of this kind of logic. So what is the argument of my book? One of the reasons I've given you this history is because I want to compare and to talk in tandem about the individual investments of personality typing and its institutional implications. Because what my book argues is that for an individual, personality type offers what I call a technology of the self. It gives you a language for understanding who you are, for communicating who you are, and for making sense of who you are within a larger system of social organization. And it tells you that you do not have to be any different than who you are. It retains that immensely non-judgmental quality that was so important to Isabel Briggs Myers. It only says that you need to bring your choices into alignment with the essential you. But on the institutional side, it operates increasingly as a technology of governance. Its history tells a very different story, a less liberatory or perhaps uplifting one than the story told by the individuals involved in it. Because from its beginning, personality testing has been used to sort people, to hire people. In the 40s and 50s, it was used to fire people, to demote them. It was used to discriminate against people on the basis of gender, race, and class. And in fact, the very idea of who had a personality was deeply governed by these kinds of notions. So for instance, when Isabel Briggs Myers was first giving the personality indicator to people at General Electric or at Standard Oil, it was largely believed that there was no point in assessing people with IQs over 100. There were different tests for women versus for men, based on the assumption that women were more prone to feeling and less prone to thinking. And it was thought that there was very little point in assessing anyone who did a job that was primarily based on manual labor. And so you can see how the history of something that appears to be liberatory can actually come bearing all kinds of different implicit biases. And I talk about these things now not because I want to accuse this particular personality indicator or any personality indicator of being racist or sexist or classist, but simply because I think to understand what function objects serve in the world today, we have to understand where it is that they came from. So what are the implications of this for coaching? For me, at least, coaching is about working with individuals in order to help them do precisely what Katharine Briggs imagined her daughter might do, which is self-actualize. And the question is, how can you do that without losing focus of the context in which that self-actualization takes place? Because I don't think any of us would deny that we want people to be happier, that we want them to feel freer, but we would want to take a very close look at the kinds of technologies and the kinds of tools that we offer them in order to achieve that. And I think we want to think very carefully about using technologies that delimit personality on the basis, or that have historically delimited personality on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, and on the basis of class. And so the idea of my book and the idea that I would leave you with today is that the liberation of the individual, the self-actualization of the individual, can only tell one part of the story of personality. The other part of it, the much darker part of it, is told by the institutions that adopt it and the purposes that they adopt it for. And so we need to think about personality as something that is always being constructed by these agents of power and that cannot escape what it is that institutions want it to be. So I will leave you with that thought, and I am excited to take any questions that might arise. Thank you for your time.
All right. There you are. Hi.
Hi,
Welcome
Anne.
back. That was wonderful, and there was really rich conversation happening in the chat. Couple of just some good deep questions, and people loving the history of this.
Oh, good. I'm so happy to hear that. That makes me feel good. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, history provides a context that, we tend to think things just like you said, like things just sort of appear, and then to know where it comes from can help us understand how to frame it. One of the questions that came up that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about is reliability and validity. And one of the things that I loved that you said was it doesn't measure what it says it measures. And I wonder if you can expand a little more on that and talk a little more about this reliability, validity aspect. And let me just give you one more piece of that. Someone also mentioned something about the Myers-Briggs step 2 being maybe a deeper dive. So talk about that a bit.
So I think that there are two things to say. And the first thing I will start out by saying is that I am not a psychometrician. I make no claims to being one. And so whatever I am reporting, I am getting from the various attempts that there have been in the history of the indicator to test its reliability and its validity. And when I speak about validity in particular, I'm thinking about some of the tests that were done on it when the Educational Testing Service was thinking about whether or not to adopt it. And the observation that was made was that many of the indicators' dimensions did not actually measure the things that they purported to measure. So, for instance, thinking and feeling, sensing, and intuition, the psychometricians there claimed, were actually proxies for things like how liberal or how open-minded somebody was. It didn't really have anything to do with whether someone was a thinking or a feeling creature. So that's just one thing to say. And, one of the other sort of follow-up points to make there is that it's actually a little bit difficult to come up with more contemporary data points on validity and reliability, in part because the kinds of people who are responsible for or who are tasked with measuring validity and reliability don't often use self-reporting psychometric instruments anymore. So when you talk to academic psychologists, for example, right, they say the reason we don't use something like MBTI is because we simply don't trust any indicator that asks you to report on yourself. And so that actually is the kind of that kind of sweeps other data issues off the table. In part, it's just a non-starter. So that's the kind of first thing that I will say is one, I'm simply reporting what other people throughout the history of the indicator have said, but two, that there's actually a disincentive in academic psychology to continue measuring the validity and reliability of self-reporting instruments.
Oh, that's fascinating. So one of the questions, and people are saying, what is there, in your opinion, is there a more valid test? But you're not, and you're saying like not according to academics, not a self-reporting one.
No, not a self-reporting one. So many academic psychologists are interested in the kinds of indicators that allow other people to report on your behavioral characteristics. And I have problems with that as well. But no, self-reporting is an issue. I mean, the second thing I'll say is that you probably got this sense from the presentation, but I really think it's impossible to understand the endurance of something like MBTI with the vocabulary that it brings as a scientific matter. I think it is just at its absolute base a matter of culture and a matter of language. And, as a literary scholar, that's what's particularly interesting to me is how is it possible to forge a language that gives people the sense of totally capturing what it is that is unique about them, but at the same time gives so many institutions the ability to organize people's behaviors in ways that we might find objectionable or that we might want to think about more historically. So ultimately, to me, it really comes down to that question of language.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's really interesting that you touch on this in your book, and then it gets, as we were talking earlier before we started, that gets really expanded in the movie Persona. Some of the problems with the way that this is now being used with big data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I will say two things. So at the end of the presentation, I ended with those sort of spoof MBTI 16 types charts, right? With Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, your Disney princess. And at this point, something like the MBTI has come to feel so innocuous that, it was not surprising that a firm like Cambridge Analytica, for instance, used a Big Five / MBTI style test to lure people in to click on the terms and services that would then allow them to scrape people's social media profiles for data that they could then sell to political consultancies who could figure out how to create targeted ads to people based on the personality profiles that they constructed from their data. So that's one just real world example that I would flag of how something that now seems like just fun and games actually serves this really insidious purpose as a Trojan horse that companies are using to get people to sign off on making their personal data available. So that's just one thing that I want to link to from where the presentation itself ended. But the second thing, and what the movie Persona does so beautifully, I think, is that it asks, well, what happens when these frameworks for thinking about personality get yoked to big data? And one of the things that they show is that this is no longer a story about the professionals and the managers, the white collar workers, the privileged and the elite who are given these personality tests to figure out how to self-actualize at work. But that in fact, these personality tests have become part of these large corporate technological infrastructures to try to do things like identify mental health issues in workers, but to do it under the guise of personality, because it's not discriminatory if you do it under the guise of personality, whereas it is if you do it under the guise of mental health. Yeah. And so the movie, I think, does a really wonderful job tracing how giving these kinds of tests to people who are, applying for entry-level positions at big companies then allows them to amass all sorts of personal data and make proxy judgments about things like mental stability and mental health
that we're not even aware of, that's just going on under the surface. And this leads to a question that came up, which I think is really it's a fascinating one. And you may not have the definitive answer, but and maybe thinking from a coaching perspective, is there more good than harm in using these tests? Is there more harm than good? What did you come down on in terms of this?
Well, one thing that I always say is that there is a proper way to use these instruments. So one of the things that they teach you when you go to MBTI training is that this is just supposed to be a kind of starting point for a conversation.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, it resembles something much more like the therapeutic model that one would expect between, say, an analyst and a client, a therapist and a client, right? A coach and a client. It just becomes an opportunity to try to develop a vocabulary that can be useful to both people. And that seems to me, within that context, that seems to me fine. And I think a great number of people get real value out of being able to talk about and to understand themselves like that, in the language of the indicator. I think the bigger problem is that it's not often used that way. Right. So I think the bigger problem is when you have when you have a situation where the intention is not to respect the humanity of the person on the other end of this, but rather it is an effort to try to make certain kinds of decisions easier or more systematic, like hiring, firing, promotion, etc. Or when you have it used, I think, in more subtly problematic ways, like to convince people to do certain kinds of jobs that they don't want to do, or to offer this to them as a kind of benefit of work, that self-actualization, self-knowledge is something that work gives us, which, might be true for some people, but it seems to me like that's something we would want to think about, like whether or not we want work to be the place where our self-knowledge comes from, right? It's just something we might want to think a little bit more deeply and critically about.
Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking about something in your presentation where you talked about, this use of saying this is sort of, there was an agenda to make people happier and work harder for less pay. So it can be used as a tool not for the individual benefit. But I really love your sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, nothing's black and white. And I'm really hearing that a coach who's using this with an individual, not to aggregate big data for a company, but to help a person understand themselves. And one of the things I love about coaches, and this came out in the conversation about, well, how do we do this? Well, you ask what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what's helpful, what's not helpful, what they can take from this in a really collaborative conversation. Then what I'm hearing is, yeah, go for it. This can be a good tool.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of what I think is the wrong way to think about it, which is, I think I tell this story in the book, and I don't think I told it in the presentation, but I remember when I was going to MBTI training, we had a young man in the training session who works as a college counselor. And he works at a small Midwestern college, and his students are primarily first generation college students, immigrants, non-white students. And he was telling the person leading the seminar that these categories and the questions that the indicator offers actually feel quite alienating to his students who, for instance, encounter a question about like, where would you like to spend your vacation? Or how do you prepare for vacation? And he says this actually throws them because family vacations were not something that they grew up with. Yeah. And we're not sure how to answer it, right? How to put themselves in that imaginative situation. And I will never forget the trainer saying, well, this is just the world they need to learn to inhabit. They need to learn this is the pool they need to learn to swim in, I believe is what was said. And that seems to me an example of where something like real forms of structural inequality, right? Inequalities of race, inequalities of class, inequalities of nationality or ethnicity are simply being set aside, and people are being told like, no, you adapt to the world as it is, rather than thinking about whether the tools the world offers you are good enough, right?
Right.
And that I think of always as an example of like what not to do or how not to think about this.
Right. That is a really potent example. And it makes me think of the earlier days of intelligence testing, where it's like, how do you measure intelligence in a context that's not your context? And that was one of the questions that we had as well, is how can, what are the culture bound socioeconomic, in terms of racial equity, socioeconomic equity, things that are built into this test, and how do practitioners help people understand that is going to have an impact on their results?
Yeah, that's a really, really wonderful question. And I don't know that I have a satisfying answer to it. I mean, one thing I would simply point out is that for years and years and years, who could have a personality was itself already restricted.
Right.
And I think I mentioned it in the presentation, but there were certain categories of workers, for instance, that Isabel Briggs Myers thought it was not worth testing because they did not have the intelligence required to develop a personality in the first place. And there's something really pernicious about putting that on the individual rather than seeing it as a larger social problem where certain classes of people are not encouraged to view themselves as unique and distinguished individuals. So I would maybe say that you can think about the bounds of any kind of tool by who is and who historically has been excluded from its initial moment of design, its initial scene of design.
Yeah, there's the embedded in that history, the bias that gets embedded in that. You said in the presentation, people over IQs over 100. Did you mean under 100? I was curious.
Oh, sorry, under. Yeah. Sorry. That's
no, good. And I was thinking, really. Oh, and now as you're saying this, I'm like, oh no, that makes sense. So under 100, you weren't considered to be smart enough to even have a personality.
Right. Or if you were a truck driver for a local beer distributor, for example. I'm just thinking of what is in the MBTI archive now. If you were a truck driver for a local beer distributor, there would be no point in testing you, in part because driving a truck didn't seem to require having a personality, right? And so this wasn't viewed as the kind of indicator that would be beneficial to you, but at the same time, you weren't then allowed to participate in that scene of developing and understanding yourself that would have been available to others. And so to me, it seems like that those kinds of decisions have resonances that continue to this day, in which we can see in that exchange that I narrated to you that happened in that training, right? Your students just need to learn to swim in the pool whose bounds are set by dominant white male culture, right?
Right. That is something also I think that comes out in the movie as well, that dominance. We're just about out of time. So it's been wonderful chatting with you. There's been really robust commentary, a lot of appreciation in the chat. People saying it's just fascinating to have the history of this thing that they never really understood or knew. And I think that's a huge contribution you have made to the world, not just of personality testing, but really this world of human development. And so really appreciating that. Anything else that you just want to say, any last words on, like key takeaways you might really want people to, grab from all of this? If you can say one more thing.
Well, I do think my publisher would kill me if I didn't say that there's more information available in the book. It's a great book itself. So thank you. I think what I will say simply is that it is so important to think about something like personality on two levels, what it does for the individual and what it does for institutions that hold power over the individual. And it's hard, but if you can think about those two things together at the same time and see how they feed one another and how they create one another, then I think that's the best kind of work that anyone can do, whether they're a coach or anything else. That many things in our world have an inherent paradox and are not all good or all bad. And that's what I really think your book and your work encourages us to do, is to question and stand in that, and not necessarily. You're very, very respectful of the MBTI and personality testing in general, and saying this is not an argument to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it is a heads up to pay more attention to how it's being used. Thank you for that, Anne. That's a very generous summary. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's a delight hanging out with you. I hope our paths cross again. And thank you to everyone who participated and for being here with us today with Merve Emre. Thanks, Merve.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Alrighty.